The dog sat beside the mess hall door like he owned it. He didn't bark, didn't beg, just waited. Behind him, in a silent, crooked line, stood a dozen Japanese POW women, watching him with equal parts suspicion and awe. That's when the cowboy said it. He won't eat unless they do. The Texas sun had bleached the dirt pale where the women stood, their uniforms loose on thin frames. The camp's usual noises, boots, cutlery, murmured orders, fell strangely quiet. All eyes were on the Hound, a blue heeler, scarred, dusty, tail flicking with patience. He'd wandered into camp weeks before, silent and mangy, ignored by most. But today, when the guards tried to hand him bacon, he turned his head away. He just stared at the women. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a game. He wouldn't eat until they were fed. And when the guards finally relented, handing the women their trays, he dug into the meat like it was his duty. The silence broke. Someone laughed, someone cried, something shifted, and none of them ever saw the world quite the same way again. It became a ritual before anyone noticed it had started. Every morning, just before the mess line began to form, the dog would appear, quiet, dusty, moving with the wary grace of something half wild and half wise. He was a blue heeler, or something close to it. Patchy gray fur, speckled with black, ears sharp, tail always flicking low. His eyes were pale and unreadable, as if dusted with ash. No one remembered exactly when he arrived. One of the guards said he wandered in from the hills beyond the wire, skinny and skittish. Another swore he'd seen him pacing the fence line for days before finally slipping through during a supply drop. No one could say for sure. He had no collar, no name, just presence. At first, the guards ignored him. Then came the jokes, calling him General because he watched the line like he was in charge. Someone tossed him a piece of bacon one morning just to see what he'd do. He sniffed it once, then walked away. That got a laugh. "Too good for pork, huh?" the cowboy had muttered, shaking his head. But the next day it happened again. The dog showed up, sat beside the chow hall door, stared toward the line of women and didn't touch a thing until the trays were in their hands. It was the same the third morning, and the fourth. By the end of the first week, even the kitchen staff noticed. The dog would sit, paws tucked neatly under him, eyes steady, unmoving. The cooks began setting aside a small portion, a strip of bacon, some eggs, maybe a biscuit, and placed it on the ground near the steps. The moment the last woman took her tray, he would rise, pad over, and eat with silent, single-minded purpose. Nothing fancy, no tricks, just a pattern so precise it began to unnerve. The guards argued over it. Some claimed it was coincidence. Others called it superstition. One insisted someone must have trained him, but no one had. He didn't come when called, he didn't beg, he didn't follow orders, and he didn't trust anyone, not fully, except, it seemed, the women. They didn't know what to make of him, either. At first they were suspicious. Animals were often used to sniff out contraband in Japanese camps. Or worse, some of them flinched when he came too close. One woman, older, sharp-eyed, spat on the ground when he brushed past her boot. But over time, the tension softened. The women began to watch for him, quietly. One even gave him a name in whispers, Tsuki, for the moonlight color of his eyes. Then came the morning everything changed. The kitchen was late. A shipment had arrived the night before and thrown off the routine. The women stood in line longer than usual, hungry, shoulders hunched against the early chill. The dog arrived, on time as always, and sat. Someone, maybe to distract him, tossed a bit of sausage his way. It bounced off his paw. He didn't even blink. "Come on, boy," a guard muttered. "You're really gonna wait?" The dog didn't move. 5 minutes, often passed, then 10. Finally, the cook emerged with trays, and the women were served. Only then, and only then, did the dog rise, stretch his limbs, and begin to eat. It stopped the camp cold. One of the younger guards looked genuinely spooked. "You saw that, right?" he asked. "He was waiting." Another, older, shook his head. "Hell, he's smarter than half of us." But the women? They didn't speak. Not then. Not aloud. They only watched him, some with wonder, some with tears they refused to wipe away. Because in that one small act, something had shifted. A line had been crossed, not with words or violence or orders, but with quiet insistence. The dog had seen them. And in a world where they had been told they no longer mattered, being seen, truly seen, was the beginning of something they could not name yet. They didn't understand it at first. How could they? These were women trained to disappear, not to be noticed, not to be seen. Most were auxiliaries, some were nurses, a few had been clerks, hunched over typewriters in damp coastal outposts. They had been captured on islands with names now swallowed by war, dragged from jungle barracks or field tents as the Empire's perimeter collapsed under fire. They'd boarded ships with wrists bound, been marched onto American soil under gray skies, and finally herded across state lines like forgotten cargo. They arrived at the camp with backs straight from fear, mouths dry from silence. Their uniforms were stained, some threadbare at the seams, others too big from weight loss during transport, hair pulled tight, faces unreadable. They stood in ranks like statues. The guards called roll, American names, clipped and unfamiliar, then opened the gate. It didn't swing, it didn't creak, it just opened. And that was the first shock. No shouting, no fists, no snarling dogs like they had heard about. Just the smell of coffee, faint and bitter, drifting from somewhere beyond the barracks. Back in the Pacific, they had been told stories, stories meant to root fear deep into the bones, that American camps were places of degradation, that surrender was worse than death. One nurse remembered how her officer had made them swear, hand to heart, that capture would mean dishonor so deep it could stain generations. "Better to bite your tongue off than speak their language," he'd told them. Another woman recalled posters hung in the canteen, showing gaunt figures shackled in chains beneath grinning American devils. Starvation, torture, humiliation, this was the certainty. But as they stepped through the gate, that certainty began to flicker. The sky was blue, wide and cloudless. The air was dry and quiet. A row of wooden barracks stood waiting, their porches clean, windows open to let in breeze. No guards screaming, no bloodstains, just a strange kind of order. Too clean, one woman muttered, too calm. And then the second shock. The dog. He was there from the start, though none of them noticed him at first. He was sitting by the mess hall, ears twitching in the breeze, not chained, not muzzled, just watching. He didn't bark, didn't growl, but he watched them. Not like a predator, not like a guard, like something trying to remember. As the women were directed to their quarters, he followed at a distance, always a few paces behind. Never too close. He would stop when they stopped, sit when they sat. When one woman dropped her bag, he came closer, not to sniff or steal, just to look. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them. She looked away first. That night, when the guards extinguished the lanterns and the camp fell into hush, the women spoke in whispers. Not about escape, not about fear. About the dog. One said he was cursed. Another said he was a spy. A third, barely 20, said he reminded her of a childhood pet in Nagasaki, before the war, before the hunger, before the silence. No one replied to that. The next morning, he was there again. He wasn't fed with the soldiers' dogs. He didn't seem to belong to anyone, and yet he belonged to the rhythm of the place, as constant as the sunrise or the clatter of tin trays. It was on the third day that one of the women noticed he wasn't just watching. He was tracking. When they were called for meals, he stood. When they marched to work detail, he followed, always from the shadows, always careful not to draw attention. If one of them lagged, he slowed. If one sat in the dirt, too tired to move, he circled near until a guard noticed. By the end of the week, they weren't sure if they were being protected or studied, but they knew this. They were not invisible. And that, in itself, was more disorienting than cruelty, because to be seen meant to be someone. And for women who had been trained to dissolve into function, uniform, obedience, silence, the gaze of a dog was the first reminder that they still had faces. But a face meant identity, and identity meant shame. That was the paradox they carried in their bones, heavier than their ration sacks or the winter blankets folded neatly at the end of each bunk. To surrender was not merely to lose. It was to vanish from honor. In training, they were taught that captivity was a worse fate than death. There were stories, some whispered, some shouted, of women who bit their tongues clean off before capture, of nurses who saved their last vial of morphine for themselves. Even the emperor's code, delivered in ceremonial oaths, carved it plainly, death before surrender. They believed it. Most of them had rehearsed it in their minds, and yet they had lived. Here they were, months later, wrapped not in flames but in clean sheets. They had not died nobly. They had woken up, and it was in the waking that the real torment began. Every comfort became a wound. The first time Aiko touched the soap, she flinched. It was thick and creamy, wrapped in brown paper and stamped with English letters she couldn't read. She had expected a lye burn or some cruel joke. Instead, it smelled faintly of lavender. It lathered easily, leaving her skin soft, slippery, unfamiliar. Another woman stood under the hot shower for so long the guards had to call her out. She wept silently, water washing away not just dirt, but belief. The food was worse, not in taste. In taste, it was heaven. Stew thick with potatoes and carrots, bread warm from the oven, butter melted into the crust. Some women ate without speaking, chewing slowly, carefully, as if memorizing. Others could barely eat at all. A few tried to hide their portions, shoving biscuits into sleeves and under mattresses, terrified it would all disappear. They did not know what to do with kindness, because kindness broke things. Cruelty could be explained, expected, survived. But mercy? Mercy disarmed. And through it all, the dog remained. He was a presence at the edge of every scene, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. He never approached the guards, never sought affection. He moved only when the women moved, ate only when they did, waited in silence while they worked the garden beds or carried laundry to the steaming huts. One morning, a woman collapsed in the yard, her legs buckling beneath her. "Heat stroke," the medic said later. But it was the dog who saw it first. He let out a low, broken sound, not quite a bark, and sprinted across the compound, nudging at her ribs with his nose. The guards were there seconds later. After that, some began calling him Kami no Me, the God's Eye, not because they thought he was divine, but because he saw things they couldn't say aloud, their shame, their hunger, their terrible unspoken gratitude. He was the only creature in that place who did not judge them, the only one who had not asked them to explain why they were still breathing. At night, when the lights dimmed and the guards walked slow circuits, under the stars the women would hear his paws in the dirt, a soft scrape, a presence by the window, a shadow curled against the outer wall. And in that silence, some of them began to imagine another possibility. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but endurance. That maybe survival was not the opposite of honor. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something else. Something with 4 legs, quiet eyes, and a refusal to look away. It was Aiko who cracked first. Not because she was weak, she was not. She had stood through storms in the Pacific, crouched beside dying men with her knees in mud and her hands slick with blood. She had stitched wounds under torchlight and memorized the smell of gangrene. She had whispered oaths to the emperor beneath a camouflage net, swearing loyalty even if her bones turned to ash. But hunger does not care about ideology. And the hunger here was not only for food. Aiko dreamed of Tokyo some nights. Not the Tokyo she left, swallowed in blackout curtains and bomb sirens, but the one before. Before conscription. Before war. When her mother grew cucumbers in the alley garden and peeled them with a rusted paring knife. When her little brother balanced glass marbles on the rail of the family balcony. In her dreams, the air was warm, not heavy. The silences were soft, not suspicious. She woke one morning with tears on her cheeks and the taste of rice that wasn't there still on her tongue. That same morning, she saw the dog waiting. He sat in his usual place near the laundry station where the wet uniforms flapped like surrender flags in the breeze. His gaze found hers the moment she stepped outside. At first, she tried to ignore him. She dunked her hands into the soapy bucket and scrubbed the stiff fabric until her knuckles ached. But he didn't move, just watched. And Aiko, for the first time in months, whispered something that was not an order or a prayer. "Why do you follow me?" she asked. He cocked his head as if weighing the question. That afternoon, during the midday meal, her stomach rebelled. The stew was hot, the bread soft, and her hands trembled with shame as she accepted it. She took her tray and sat on the edge of the mess yard, under the shadow of the fence. The dog approached, slowly, sat beside her, not begging, just there. She looked down at the biscuit, then at him. "You watch me eat," she said softly, "but you never ask." He didn't blink, so she broke the biscuit in half, placed the smaller piece gently in the dirt beside him. He didn't devour it. He sniffed it, nosed it, then, only after a long moment, took it in his mouth and ate. Not greedily, not hungrily, just enough. When she looked up again, 2 other women were watching from a distance. One narrowed her eyes. The other looked away quickly. That night, the dog lay curled beside the step of her barrack. The next morning, he was waiting again. And the camp noticed. The guards made jokes first. "Looks like you've got yourself a shadow, Miss Tokyo." But the other women said nothing. Not at first. Then came the murmurs. "She feeds him. She thinks she's better than us. Maybe she's forgotten what shame means." Aiko felt the sting of their glances during roll call. She worked faster in the laundry, spoke less in the barracks, but the dog never left her side. And slowly the tension shifted. One woman, older, once a clerk in Saipan, left a scrap of bread on the windowsill one morning. She didn't look to see if it was taken. Another, silent since the day they arrived, reached out to touch the dog's fur when he passed. Just once. The men saw it, too. A guard remarked to another, "That mutt's doing more for peace than half the damn Geneva Convention." And though no one said it aloud, a silent truth began to take shape in the camp's dust and hush. That biscuit was more than food. It was the first exchange of trust, a flicker of warmth in a place built to be cold. And from that flicker, something began to smolder. Not rebellion, not forgiveness, but recognition of what had been lost and what still might be left to save. It wasn't just the prisoners who began to change. The men on the other side of the wire, khaki-shirted, sunburned, boots always dusty, started to shift too. Most of them were farm boys or cowhands from Oklahoma, Nebraska, Texas. They came from land so flat the sky felt like it might tip over. Their silence wasn't born of malice, but habit. They didn't speak unless they had something to say, and even then it was usually said slow, like molasses being poured over judgment. These men knew animals better than they knew people, knew what a twitch in the flank meant, knew what it meant when a dog stopped barking. So when the camp dog started shadowing Iko, they didn't laugh it off. Not entirely. One of the guards, Hank Delaney, tall, freckled, with a drawl like falling rope, started watching closer. He'd been a ranch hand outside Abilene before the draft got him, raised around blue heelers and mutts that could herd cattle like second nature. When he saw the way the dog stuck to Iko, how he wouldn't eat until the women did, wouldn't bark, wouldn't stray, he scratched his chin and said, almost to himself, "That ain't no accident. That's a hound with a code." Word spread. They started calling him Chap. Short for chaplain, some said. Others said it was cowboy slang for one of us. Either way, Chap became more than a mutt. He became a symbol, not officially, no one wrote it down, but in the way men begin to speak differently when something softens in their chest. Hank called the women the Hound's girls, not with cruelty, not like a label, but like an offering, and when he said it, the tone shifted. At first, the women bristled. Girls was not a term of respect where they came from, but something in Hank's voice, plain, unschooled, but not unkind, gave it another shape. He meant it the way ranchers speak about their own, with protectiveness, not possession. And when Iko laughed one morning, just a breath of a laugh, catching herself mid-chuckle after Hank said it, the camp noticed. It was the first time anyone had heard laughter across the wire. From that moment on, Chap became a camp legend. The men started keeping track of his rounds. One swore Chap had barked only once, and that was when a guard dropped his weapon by accident. Another said he'd seen him walk straight through a fight between two wasps and not flinch. They said he could smell a lie, that he knew when someone was about to cry. In the barracks, the stories grew, too. One woman swore Chap slept near her door during the worst night of her fever. Another said he had herded her away from a rattlesnake near the compost pit. Whether true or not didn't matter. Myth was forming, and myth is how survival gets carried. Chap became their common language. The guards started leaving scraps at the edge of the mess hall. "Don't tell the sergeant," they'd mutter, but they did it anyway. The women began scratching small messages in the dust near his paws. Nothing dangerous, just names, dates, symbols, little things that said, "I am still here." Hank started tipping his hat when he passed Iko and the others, not in mockery, in respect. Once he said, "A man's judged by his dog. You ask me, that hound don't take to just anyone." And slowly, without anyone meaning to, the barbed wire lost a little of its bite. Not the war, not the grief. That all remained. But within this fenced square of dust and ghosts, a strange new gospel was being written, one where honor didn't have to wear a uniform and kindness could ride in on 4 legs, uninvited but unmistakable. And for the first time, both sides of the wire looked at each other and didn't just see enemies. They saw people, and seeing people meant remembering that they themselves had once been seen too, by mothers at doorways, by brothers running through alleys, by neighbors who bowed in morning light. That memory hurt more than hunger ever had. It hurt because now they were allowed to speak again, not with their hands or their labor, but with words. The camp gave them paper, thin and yellow, and pencils worn down to soft stubs. The announcement came in clipped English and hesitant Japanese. They could write home. Limited lines, no politics, no military details, censorship strict, names, locations, instructions, all forbidden, only personal matters, only the neutral truth of being alive. For some of the women the paper felt heavier than stone. They stared at the blank page as though it might judge them. How do you explain survival to those who believed surrender meant disgrace? How do you write about warm soup when your own mother boiled weeds? How do you describe a dog who guards you like family when the enemy was supposed to be a beast? Aiko held her pencil for nearly an hour before she let it touch the page. Her wrist trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of her own conscience. She thought of her father's last letter before the city burned, his careful handwriting telling her to be brave, to honor the family name, to never forget the emperor watched over her. She wondered if he would recognize the hand that now wrote beneath his words, softer, slower, full of hesitation. Some of the women wrote only the bare minimum. I am alive. I am not wounded. I eat. I sleep. They wrote in the language of survival, stripped down so tightly that no one could accuse them of weakness. Others couldn't resist confession, though they feared it. One woman wrote about the blankets, another described the taste of bread, and a few, only a few, wrote about Chap. They didn't use his name. They didn't dare. They wrote instead, "There is a dog here. He is not ours, but he watches us. He refuses to eat if we have not been fed. He sleeps outside our doors. He makes this place feel less like a cage." They wrote these lines like someone smuggling air into a sealed room, but fear crept into every curve of their handwriting. Would their families think they had betrayed the nation? Would their neighbors whisper that they had gone soft in enemy hands? Would their words be twisted into proof of disloyalty? The officers gathered the letters in quiet stacks. They were taken to a small wooden building at the edge of the camp, where American censors examined each one under dim lamps. Sentences were scratched out with blue pencil, paragraphs torn away. Anything that hinted at location or morale was blacked into silence. The women knew this. It was not a secret. But they also knew another truth. Some of their words would travel beyond the wire. They did not know how far. Thousands of miles away, in an office shadowed by portraits of a fallen emperor and maps now useless, a clerk in Tokyo unfolded one of those letters with stiff fingers. The paper had crossed oceans, fingers, rules, and lies. He read it twice, then a third time. The writer did not name the camp. She did not break instructions, but she wrote about the dog. "He will not eat unless we do," the line read. "He sits outside our quarters like a guardian spirit. The Americans leave him scraps, but he waits for us. He knows hunger, but he also knows restraint." The clerk frowned. He passed it to a superior officer. The officer read it, jaw tightening. He passed it upward again, like a stone being pushed through deep water. By the time it reached the hands of a tired intelligence analyst, the room had grown silent. They had spent years painting the enemy as monsters, and now a dog, an American dog, was being described as a symbol of discipline, of loyalty, of care toward Japanese prisoners. It made no sense. Some dismissed it as psychological damage, captivity, madness. Others suspected foreign manipulation, but one detail unsettled even the hardest men, the absence of bitterness in the woman's words. There was confusion, yes, shame implied, but not hatred, and that was more dangerous than defiance. Back in the camp, the women waited. Weeks passed. Some received replies, written in cramped script, filled with relief and sorrow. Mothers thanking gods they no longer believed in. Sisters promising to wait. Neighbors reporting rubble where homes once stood. But not all letters returned. Aiko's did, folded, smudged, smelling faintly of smoke and damp paper. Her mother wrote simply, "If he watches over you, thank him. Even dogs understand duty." Aiko read the line again and again, not because it answered her questions, but because it softened them. Because behind the barbed wire, under foreign skies, beside a silent hound, her life had not ended. It had merely been forced into another shape, and somewhere between the ink on her fingers and the dust on Chap's fur, she understood that survival carried its own quiet loyalty, one no empire could ever command. But loyalty, once awakened, doesn't lie still. It begins to stretch, to ache, to ask questions. So when the food didn't come, not on time, not warm, not at all, something in the women pushed back. The delay wasn't meant to provoke anything. A supply truck had broken down. A miscommunication, the guards said. But words like delay meant nothing to stomachs that had already shrunk on the journey from the Pacific, and even less to hearts trying to claw back a shred of dignity. The women sat on the ground outside the mess hall and did not move. They didn't raise their voices, didn't chant. They simply did not eat. It wasn't loud, but it was thunderous, not because of what it sounded like, but because of what it meant. They were reclaiming the one thing that had not yet been taken, the choice to suffer on their own terms. This time, it was not about hunger alone. It was about control, about shame, about trying, even in a cage, to forge meaning. And Chap, as always, understood something was different. He approached Aiko, sniffed the untouched tray at her feet, then looked into her face. She didn't speak, just offered a quiet, firm glance. That was enough. The dog sat beside her. Then he laid down, and, for the first time in days, refused the scraps one of the guards tossed toward him. At first, the men laughed. "Damn mutt's gone on strike, too," someone muttered. But the laughter didn't last, because when you've spent years around animals, you learn to spot when something's not a trick. You know when a creature's made a choice. Chap didn't look sick. He looked resolute. He stayed beside the women hour after hour, even when the sun baked the dirt into dust, and flies circled lazily in the heat. By the second day, word had spread through every corner of the camp. The women were refusing rations. The dog was refusing food. The guards didn't know whether to intervene or wait. After all, no one had ordered this. There was no manifesto, no demand, just silence and solidarity. One evening, as dusk began to fold over the compound like a worn blanket, something shifted. Hank, the cowboy from Abilene, the one who first called them the Hound's girls, walked up to the fence with a biscuit in hand. He didn't throw it. He placed it on the ground. Chap looked at him, ears twitching, and didn't move. "Damn fool," Hank muttered. But his voice cracked slightly. Later that night, the kitchen lit up. A new stew was made. Bread was warmed again, and in a gesture that no one quite understood, or maybe understood too well, the guards set up the tables a little closer to the fence. They didn't say it was because of the protest. They didn't acknowledge the Hound. But the food was served hot, and it came with extra ladles. The women didn't rush to eat. They waited, looked to Aiko. She looked to Chap. He stood up slowly, walked to the nearest tray, sniffed the air, and ate. Only then did the women rise. No orders had been given, no sides declared. But something passed between prisoner and captor that night, invisible yet irreversible. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was recognition of will, of pain, of the strange, soft power that comes from standing still, together, even when the world expects you to stay broken. And under that quiet sky, as Chap curled up beneath the barrack steps, fed but not full, a kind of truth settled into the dust. No language needed, just ears that listened. The fire was little more than embers now, flickering low and red against the chill that crept into the Texas dusk. Smoke drifted upward in thin ribbons, curling like thoughts too quiet to speak. Chap lay curled between two women, his breathing steady, his body a warm barrier between silence and solitude. His ears twitched, not from alarm, but from the faint sound rising nearby, a harmonica, slow and sweet, as though someone had pulled music from the dust itself. The man playing it was one of the younger guards, not more than 20. He sat alone near the supply shack, cap pushed back, eyes half-lidded. The tune was unfamiliar, yet ancient. Notes hung in the air like laundry on a line, unhurried, vulnerable, and impossibly human. Aiko didn't move, but another woman did. Sayuri, a translator's assistant once. She hadn't spoken much since her capture. Her voice, when she did use it, was soft, almost uncertain, like a language she no longer trusted. But now, as the harmonica wept gently into the firelight, Sayuri began to hum. It was faint at first, so faint Aiko thought she'd imagined it. But then Chap lifted his head, ears pricked toward the sound, and Aiko knew it was real. Sayuri was humming, matching the tune, not because she knew it, but because she remembered it, or something like it. Later, she would say it reminded her of her brother. Back in Kyoto, before conscription, before the sky fell, he used to sing a lullaby to their younger sister, one foot tapping on the tatami mat, his voice thin and proud. He had gone off to Manchuria and never returned. But that night, with the fire low and the guard's harmonica drifting like a dream, Sayuri let herself hum again, and as she did, her body shifted just slightly, as though some weight she'd carried too long had slipped from her shoulders. It wasn't just the music, it was what the music allowed. In a place built on silence, music was dangerous, not because it stirred rebellion, but because it stirred memory. It let the past in, creeping through the cracks, left by fatigue and hunger. It reminded them of who they had been before they were told who they must be. It reminded them that war had not started with them, and would not end with them either. Chap, still nestled between the women, let out a low sigh. His head dropped to his paws, but he did not sleep. His eyes remained open, reflecting the fire, reflecting Sayuri's face. There was something sacred in his stillness, as if he understood that this moment was not meant to be interrupted. Around them, the camp was quiet. No orders, no footsteps, just the soft scrape of wind and the song that hung in it. For the women, that night became something else, not quite healing, not yet, but a shift. They spoke more softly to each other the next morning. One offered her scarf to another when the frost lingered longer than usual. A guard, who usually scowled, brought a tin of honey to the kitchen, saying only, "For the IT." Music had done what rations and routine could not. It cracked open the shell of survival and let memory flood in. And with memory came the faintest echo of identity, not as soldiers or captives, but as sisters, daughters, humans. Chap remained their anchor, not just to the present, but to a version of themselves they feared they had lost. He had not changed. He did not need to. His consistency, his quiet companionship, became the foundation upon which something fragile could be built. something like peace, or the early sketches of forgiveness. And as Sayuri hummed her brother's song into the fading firelight, she did not weep. Not quite. But the next morning, her first word in days was spoken not to another woman or to a guard, but to Chap. A single syllable. Gentle. Grateful. Stay. If you've been moved by this story so far, take a second to like the video and drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. The word lingered longer than the smoke from the night before, hanging over the compound like a prayer that didn't know where to land. Sayuri had whispered it to Chap, but by morning it seemed to belong to all of them. And then, before they could anchor themselves to that small comfort, the announcement came. The war was over. It arrived without drama. No sirens, no fanfare. Just a notice pinned beside the mess hall door and a quiet murmur that spread across the yard like wind over dry grass. Repatriation would begin soon. The women would be sent home. Not immediately. Nothing happened immediately in places built on waiting. But in weeks, they were told. A word so vague it felt unreal. Weeks. A bridge made of fog. Some cried. Some didn't react at all. Aiko simply stood with her hands folded, watching Chap pace for no reason she could name. His tail flicked, but not with the easy rhythm of before. He sensed disruption before they dared to speak it. Preparation began like a slow undoing. The women packed their few belongings into canvas bags they had once been issued as burdens and now treated as vessels of another life. They were given new papers, numbers scribbled in neat American handwriting, stamped and restamped by men who spoke to them gently now, almost like neighbors preparing to say goodbye. But there was a rule. There were always rules. "No animals aboard," the sergeant said one afternoon as they were gathered in the yard. His voice wasn't cruel, just tired. Military transport, quarantine regulations. Words that carried the weight of gates that could not be opened. The women didn't answer. They didn't protest. They just looked down. Chap, unaware of policy, trotted between them, tail low, eyes searching faces as if trying to solve a problem without language. He had grown closer in the last few days, slept closer, watched closer, as though he sensed his purpose tightening, as though he knew the ground beneath him was already shifting. One night, Aiko sat on the barrack step with her bag beside her and her hands empty. Chap placed his head on her knee. He didn't whine, didn't ask, just anchored himself there like a stone in water. She rested her hand on his fur and felt the steady pulse beneath. Alive, real, not made of paper or ink like the letter she still carried in her pocket. But the dog could not go with them. That truth sank like cold into every corner of the camp. Not just for the women, for the guards, too. Some of them didn't pretend indifference anymore. They'd grown used to his pacing, his watch, his stubborn rituals. He was part of the air now, part of the way mornings began. And then a letter arrived. Not from overseas this time. Not from a mother or a brother or a city trying to rebuild itself from bone. This one came from Hank. He didn't hand it to Aiko himself. He had someone else do it. Some distance was still needed, some lines still drawn. The envelope was plain, no seal, just her name written the way he always spoke it, slow, careful, like it carried weight. Inside was a short note, folded once. "He doesn't write much," the guard who delivered it said. "Never did. But he wanted this to get to you." Aiko opened it with hands that refused to tremble. The message was simple. "He'll stay with us. He's got girls to watch over here, too. No flourish, no apology, just a promise." She read it once, then again, then pass it to Sayuri, then to the others. The paper moved through their hands like something holy, like shared oxygen. They didn't smile. Not exactly, but something softened. Relief, perhaps, or something stranger, gratitude without possession. It was not the goodbye they'd imagined, but it was an answer, and sometimes that was enough. The last night before their scheduled departure, they sat together beneath a thin crescent of moon. Chap lay in the center of their circle, head on his paws, breathing slow. He didn't know he was staying behind. Or maybe he did. Dogs had a way of understanding the things humans refused to say. No one spoke much. Words felt clumsy now. Aiko bent down and pressed her forehead gently to his. For a moment only, just long enough to leave warmth, just long enough to remember the shape of him. He didn't move, and she realized then, with a quiet that hurt more than crying, that leaving didn't always mean abandoning. Sometimes it meant trusting what stayed behind to continue the work you were too tired to carry. The truck engines would start in the morning, and Chap would still be there, waiting, watching, for other girls who would one day step through the wire with hollow eyes and learn, as they had, that even in a world torn open, loyalty could take the shape of a dog beside a dusty gate. The photograph was tucked inside a rusted biscuit tin, the kind sold in Tokyo markets back when sugar was still rationed and metal still carried the scent of soot. It had been folded once, carefully, and wrapped in a scarf worn so thin it was nearly translucent. When Aiko's granddaughter found it while clearing out the small apartment in Suginami, the ink had already begun to fade, but the image was unmistakable. A young woman in American khaki, a borrowed coat slung over her shoulders, stood beside a blue heeler with ears sharp as knives and eyes like burning coals. Behind them fluttered an American flag. Beneath the photograph, in neat, deliberate strokes, was a note. "He ate when we did. He stayed when we couldn't." By then, Aiko had long since passed. A quiet funeral, a scattering of ashes, and a shrine with her name chiseled into stone, no one visited often. But the photograph, once unearthed, held more power than any eulogy. Her granddaughter, barely old enough to remember war only as textbook chapters, stared at the image with a confusion that gave way to reverence. The dog, the camp, the flag, none of it made sense, and yet all of it did. Aiko never spoke much of her years as a prisoner. Japan was not kind to its repatriated women. Shame was a second skin. She returned to a country bruised by loss and bound by silence. She found work in a hospital, quiet work, washing linen, arranging bandages, speaking only when necessary. She married, bore children, buried a husband. But she never forgot the dog. In moments of stillness, sometimes as tea cooled beside her or rain danced against paper screens, she would reach for that scarf-wrapped photo and hold it close. Never for show, never for others, just to remember. Not the camp, not the guards, not even the war, but him, the hound who refused food unless they were fed, who laid beside them in the dirt when dignity seemed a memory, who stayed. Over the years, Chap became a ghost stitched into the seams of her memory, not with sorrow, but with quiet strength. He had not saved them, not in the dramatic sense, but he had borne witness. That mattered more. He had seen them in a place designed to erase. In post-war Tokyo, reconstruction moved like molasses. Buildings rose faster than spirits. People learned to walk past each other without nods, to carry grief in the curve of their backs. Aiko fit in well. She knew how to be invisible, but in her silence was something else. Not just endurance, but a truth sharper than grief. That sometimes dignity doesn't roar. Sometimes it pads on 4 legs and curls up beside the broken without asking for anything. The photo now sits framed in her granddaughter's living room. Visitors ask about it, puzzled by the image. "Who's the woman?" they say. "And why the dog?" The granddaughter smiles, tells them only, "That's my grandmother. And that dog? He taught her to live." In a world drowning in monuments to war, to generals, to flags waving above ruins, there are few markers for the quiet acts of loyalty that stitched lives back together. But sometimes they are preserved in ink and instinct, in a snapshot tucked inside a biscuit tin, or in the way a woman's hand rests on an empty patch of earth, remembering warmth. He didn't follow them home. He didn't have to, because he had already arrived, carried in their ribs, in their letters, in the way they chose, for the rest of their lives, to see the world not as a battlefield, but as something still capable of kindness. If this story stayed with you, like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your words mean a lot to us.